Thank you for joining us on another edition of Against the Current, coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. My name is Dan Proft, and our guest on this episode is Ted Dabrowski, who is the Vice President of Policy for the Illinois Policy Institute, a free market think tank, economic liberty-oriented think tank in downtown Chicago. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, there's a lot to talk about. You've got judicial decisions as it relates to pensions, both at the state level with regard to Chicago pensions, coming on the heels of a Illinois State Supreme Court decision from just a year earlier on state pensions. And then you've got the Supreme Court decision because of the Scalia absence in the Friedrichs v. California Teachers Association as it pertains to forced union dues. So a lot to talk about against the backdrop of the second teacher strike looming in less than 4 years and a almost junk-rated city of Chicago, according to Fitch, mostly because of the inability to solve the pension problem, combined with a junk-rated Chicago public school system, combined with a state that has the worst credit rating in the United States. So some challenges, I think, is a fair assessment.
Some pretty big challenges.
Yeah. So why don't we start with Chicago Public Schools and the looming teacher strike over the teachers' unwillingness to increase their contribution from 2 percentage points of the 9 percentage points they pay into the pension system to not have the Chicago Public School System pick up the other 7 percentage points anymore, as has been the case for the past 3 decades. Of course, the management side wants them to pick it up so they can start trying to make the math work, and the teachers don't want to essentially take a pay cut to increase their contribution to their pensions. Why is the teacher's position unreasonable? Why should they pick up the 7 percentage points that the school system has been picking up for low these past 3 decades? Isn't that just another promise that was made to them? Like they say, the Constitution made a promise to them and it shall never be changed?
Well, you know, it's another perk that Chicago teachers have had for a long time. And it was gained back in 1981. And, you know, the issue, I think, the bigger issue is that the Chicago teachers do pretty well when you compare them to big cities across the country. They have the highest salaries of any big school district in the nation. And so what's amazing is that...
So higher than New York, higher than California, than LA, higher than Houston.
Higher than Miami, et cetera. So they do pretty well. And again, it's something they've negotiated, but they've done well. And included in that is this teacher pension pickup. And that's fancy words for, look, teachers, you don't have to pay your full pension share, your full pension payment that you're required to pay. We, the school district, which means taxpayers, will pay it on your behalf. And that's been going on for about 3 decades, and the school district is broke. Any way you look at it, it's broke. And so CPS, Claypool, and others trying to fix the problem are asking the teachers just to pay their fair share.
And by the way, I mean, I had the opportunity on the morning show that I do on AM 560, Chicago's Morning Answer, to speak with Jean-Claude Brizard a couple of CPS superintendents ago. This is not the CPS superintendent that's going to jail, for those of you scoring at home. Yeah. But they were running billion-dollar budget deficits when he arrived as Rahm Emanuel's first Chicago Public School superintendent. Nothing has changed in the intervening 5 years. In fact, it's gotten worse. So do we start with the pension pickup and the distribution of who's picking it up? Or do we start with the fact that 9% paying into your pension, that's also insufficient?
Right, that's insufficient. I think that the bigger issue is that this school district has been mismanaged for a long time. And you've got issues from not funding pensions for nearly a decade. You've got issues of Barbara Byrd Bennett being indicted for fraud. You've got a situation where you've got a teachers union that's willing to strike 2 contracts in a row. And they won the last contract. They won big, despite the fact, you know, they struck despite the fact that the city or the district was already $1 billion in the hole. They had no business striking then, and they have no business striking now. So really what you've got is a situation.
But they struck because they struck, they won. So they're not incentivized to do anything other than strike if they don't get what they want, because they figure the politicians will bend over like Tiny Dancer did 4 years ago.
And he's even weak. If he was weak then, he's weaker now, right. Given the situation he has at home. So, you know, this is a situation where the 2 big groups, the administration and the teachers union, they collude when they need to. They strike when it's, makes sense for them. And in the end, it's always the kids who get left out. And I think that's the whole sad part of the story, which is why many people talk about bankruptcy. If Rahm Emanuel doesn't want to do something about the finances, if Karen Lewis doesn't want to do something about the finances, let it go bankrupt and finally get a situation where we can get a focus back on the kids and not on the adults.
Well, that's what the governor said. Governor Rauner has said, bankruptcy needs to be something that the city and CPS take under consideration. They've rejected that because, of course, nobody wants to be the person or people in charge, right, to be taken over by the state, to go bankrupt on my watch. What does that say about my leadership and my management, making the tough decisions to bring us back from the precipice rather than pushing us over? So why not, and this is more of a political question than a policy one, but from Governor Rauner's perspective, I've offered to pitch in and help. I've offered, here are some options. And by the way, I have a kind of a 30-year track record. The reason I'm a 100 millionaire is because I'm pretty good at reading balance sheets and understanding what the real world options are. And if they don't want to entertain real world options, why not just wash your hands of it and say, okay, geniuses, okay, Tiny Dancer, okay, Karen Lewis, whatever, Forrest Claypool, you figure it out. But you can come down to Springfield, with your pickle buckets and panhandle outside the Capitol, and we're not giving you any more money.
Yeah, and I think politically that's where it goes. I think that's where it goes. Now, the sad part is, and I think everybody knows this, is that, we just had a massive property tax hike in Chicago, the largest on record. And that only solves a small part of the problem. We probably need to have another 2 of those to try to start getting toward balance. And so the sad part is that Chicagoans who are already burned with all kinds of nickel and diming fees and red light camera, anything you want to talk about, there's a fee or a tax for it. Chicagoans can't afford more, and we've already heard about people leaving the city. So,
but at least the teachers are honest about it. Teachers union's honest about it. I mean, I give them credit. They're kind of like Bernie Sanders. They're like the honest socialist as opposed to the disingenuous socialist. Property tax increase? Sure. See, Chicago Teachers Union is on board for that. Karen Lewis? Yeah. Graduated state income tax? Yep. Fine.
financial services tax?
Yeah, on LaSalle Street, right? On the exchanges, financial transaction. Good. Contemplating the institution of a new city income tax to layer on to all the other taxes. We're open to that. All they care about is the revenue side. At least they're genuine about it so you can have an honest conversation. Tiny Dancer and the Chicago Democrats trying to cling to power, they understand the political difficulty of that because they have to stand for election outside of 30,000 teachers. And so they play this game like something can be solved by getting $500 million every other month from the state of Illinois. Number one, that doesn't solve it. Number two, it's not going to happen. So do you give the teachers union at least credit for being honest so we can have an honest conversation about here's what they want to solve the problem? That's one option. Confiscatory taxation on top of confiscatory taxation. And, here's another option like you and the Illinois Policy Institute have charted that presents a real choice for Chicago residents and Illinois residents to consider.
Yeah, I think, you're right. They are, let's say, honest about their motives. CTU and Karen Lewis is pretty clear about it. But I think that's why we call them the most militant union in the U.S. They say what they want, they strike for it, and they go for it.
And they unironically wear red shirts to their rallies. I mean, could you beat me over the head with a cudgel? I get it.
And I think the saddest part for me is, and the parents haven't figured it out yet, still the parents are still backing with the union. In the first strike they did, it still seems like they have backing, but at some point that's going to break. And when people realize that those strikes mean bigger and bigger tax increases, bigger property tax increases, especially for the low-income families, right? Because they may not pay property taxes because they're owners, but they certainly pay higher rent. They certainly pay higher sales taxes, higher X, Y, and Z. And so at some point, there's got to be a connection.
But those are the unseen costs that they don't are people connecting the dots? Because it seems to me what Karen Lewis is good at doing, and to some extent Rahm is good at doing as well, is presenting it like Rahm and Karen Lewis are on the opposite sides. Well, they're not on the opposite sides. They're fighting over who gets to be the central planner in charge, right? And so the free market perspective, the economic liberty movement, to some extent has to also bear some culpability for not charting a third way and explaining to people that you're getting played by both sides. They're not looking out for your best interests, and they don't have a plan that solves this without imposing additional duress on you, on your children, on the taxpayers writ large so that the city continues to shrink and the number of revenue producing wards continues to winnow, and we continue the death spiral to a place that you're not going to be insulated from in terms of pain.
No, I think you're right. These guys have always worked together. That's why I say they collude. They're like two monopolies or an oligopoly, and they work together pretty closely. They choose to fight every once in a while. But never, and if you think about this, never are the discussions and the fights about better outcomes. We don't hear much about that. It's all about who's going to win the power struggles, whether it's Rahm, whether it's Karen Lewis, whether it's Claypool, whether it's Rauner in a takeover. But nobody's talking about how to help the parents win. And what you're right about is that really this is a battle over who controls billions of dollars in salary and billions of dollars in pension payments. And Rahm loves to be in control of that, and so does Karen Lewis.
And of the $6 billion CPS budget, what is it, a third of it is salaries?
Oh, yeah, you got over $2 billion, sure. And so that's the control power. And so when we talk about, and you're right, the free market movement hasn't done a great job in Chicago, in Illinois, about saying, hey, it's time we take the power out of Rahm Emanuel. It's time we take the power away from Karen Lewis and give it to the families. Let them be in control of the dollars and let them hold schools accountable. And by that, I mean a parent would have the ability to walk away from the school and use that public money at a private school if he or she wasn't having their sons or their kids' needs met.
Or public school.
Or public school. It could just be give the parents the power to walk. And when the parents have that power, then the public schools would have to listen.
Well, you say, the parents side with Karen Lewis and the teachers union. Well, that's because they experience the teachers, right? Their kids experience the teachers. And so they like Mrs. Smith, who teaches fourth grade, and they like Mr. Jones, who teaches eighth grade. They know those two. So when Mrs. Smith or Mr. Jones or their local school principal says, are you going to throw in with me, or are you going to throw in with that little kleptocrat on the fifth floor of City Hall? I mean, that's an easy choice.
Mm-hmm. It is. But I think, though, more and more teachers are starting to realize it. If you're a 35-year-old teacher and you hear the arguments going on, you say, wait a minute, is there going to be a pension for me when I'm going to contribute for years? Will there be a pension for me? And I got a call yesterday, as a matter of fact, from a teacher. She's 67, retired from CPS, lives in the suburbs, and she's scared to death about whether her pension is going to be cut totally.
When did she retire?
She retired it's just a few years ago.
Okay.
So
about the average age, maybe 63, which is like the average age of a CPS teacher retiring?
No, average retirement age is closer to 60.
60,
so,
okay.
Over half retire in their 50s. And you're hitting on a good point, Dan. The reason these pensions are so expensive is because the average worker who works there is retiring in their 50s, most of them with full benefits. And because they get automatic cost of living adjustments, those pension benefits double after 25 years. It's a fantastic gig, and it's something that taxpayers can't afford.
So let's talk numbers. So you kind of get out of the unfunded liabilities and the billions and this and that don't mean anything to most people, and you can't kind of distill down to something they can relate to. Let's relate it. So the Chicago public school teacher retiring in 2014 with 30 years in, max out in terms of pension. What annual pension are they receiving?
About $68,000.
$68,000.
Right, $68,000.
Which is almost 40% more than the median household income in Illinois.
Oh, sure. Not
close.
Yeah, close.
Close. And so
you're compared to median household income,
household
right?
income.
Right, that's more than one person.
So maybe it's 25% higher than the median household income in Chicago. It's still a big number. Mm-hmm. So, and I've looked at the work that you and Illinois Policy Institute has done, so I just want to relate these numbers because they are staggering. That's for anybody that works in the private sector, and frankly, anybody that works. Chicago Public School, this is IPI numbers. A Chicago Public School teacher retiring in 2014, 30 years in, will have paid, these are round numbers, $133,000 into their pension.
That's right.
Will receive $2.1 million back.
That's correct.
A 15,000% plus return on investment.
And let me just say one thing, that 133 is giving the teacher credit for having made the full payment, when in fact the school district was picking up.
Well, they made less than 25% of it.
Correct. That's right. So it's phenomenal. These are great returns.
Right. So, boy, how do we have a bankrupt school system and a bankrupt city and a bankrupt, I mean, come on.
How many people in the private sector have $2 million from having a career sitting there waiting for them for their retirement? And look, and I want to say...
What's the private sector counterpart? I think you guys have this too. So if you wanted to the average retiree, kind of similarly situated, if you wanted to receive $2.1 million in pension benefits back, pay yourself 70 grand plus a year in retirement, how much would you have had to contribute into your 401k?
Around $1.5 million, because interest rates are so low. So you'd have to put in a lot of money just to get that.
So in the private sector, it's $1.5 million in for 2.1 back. At CPS, it's 133 in
Correct.
for 2.1 million back.
Correct. And it's just phenomenal. And it's not sustainable. And don't forget, the reason why it's so high, that 2.1 million, is because they get that 3% automatic bump in their pension benefit each period.
The cost of living adjustment, which turns out to be an annuity because that's 7 times the rate of inflation for the last decade.
Correct. And so basically, somebody's pension benefit doubles over 25 years. It's phenomenal.
And this is the case. I mean, not to get too far afield off of teachers and CPS, since that's really kind of at bar with the strike looming in May, but it's the numbers for Chicago firefighters, for Chicago police officers, for City of Chicago municipal employees, for City of Chicago laborers and labor union public sector, they're basically the same.
Pretty similar, yeah. I mean, of course, Chicago police and fire will be a little higher, but basically it's the same. And you're talking about the average career worker getting somewhere in $2 million and more in retirement. And it's really hard to ask taxpayers who are struggling to pay that over and over again.
And so, when you look at these numbers, the public sector union, and frankly, a lot of the rank and file, their response is, wait a second, why are you attacking teachers and firefighters and police officers? Don't you respect the job we do? And even if you say you respect the job that we do, hey, look, we played by the rules that were set forward by the politicians that set the rules. So why should we take a haircut when they made a promise and we relied on that promise?
No, I think it's a good argument. Look, I always want to blame the people who set the laws. It's the politicians who agree to bad deals. I think everybody fights for their own special interest, whether it's a teacher's union or an employee wanting a raise or better terms. So I think it's important that we don't vilify teachers or cops. You know, my kids go to the public schools. I love my kids' teachers. I think they do a great job. But the bottom line is, this is not about that. This is about a state's ability and people's ability and taxpayers' ability to pay for these benefits. And so I don't think we should vilify them, but I think there has to be a realization that the agreement, whatever it was, you know, we should meet whatever obligations we made. Whatever has been promised and has been earned, we should pay. But going forward, we need to strike a new deal. And I think that's what this whole discussion is about, striking a new deal that's fair for the public sector workers, but also fair for the taxpayers that fund them.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that because this seems to get lost in the conversation. I have an opportunity to talk to and hear from public sector workers a lot in my radio program. And they don't seem to hear it when I say, wait a second, whatever you've earned, even if it was a bad deal, you should get, because there was reliance created by the state. You did anticipate these benefits. You earned the benefits. You should receive what you've earned. However, full stop. However, at a date into the future, certain, like, you know, a year from now, there's a new deal for existing workers who have not earned those benefits because they haven't worked those days in the future yet, as well as for new hires, that it's not going to be the same deal that you have now. In point of fact, don't we have that in state employees with the Tier 2 for new hires at this point, even at present? Sure.
So, you know, Tier 2, of course, is a brand new employee, but I think what we're saying is that for even existing employees, and this happened in the private sector, happens in the private sector every day, you know, the private sector can't take away benefits that you've already earned. Right? That would be a huge problem. And that shouldn't happen here in Illinois either at the state level or city level. But going forward, we have to have a deal that allows the state budget, the city budgets, you know, because we haven't talked about cities. This is a huge problem all across Illinois with pensions for firemen and policemen.
And nationally.
And nationally, of course. It's a huge problem everywhere. And, you know, it's pushing up property taxes. I'd like to talk about that in a minute about all the taxes that are going up. But, at some point, there has to be a new deal, because otherwise, here's the issue. Right now, you and I are saying we want to protect benefits already earned. If we ever go into bankruptcy courts, federal courts don't care about state constitution. Federal courts trump the state constitution. And so, like you saw in Detroit, like you've seen in Alabama, like you've seen in Rhode Island, pensions have been cut as a result of bankruptcies. And so, if the public sector union workers don't finally realize that they could actually have their pensions cut under bankruptcy, they're going to get hit with exactly what they don't want to see.
So they're listening to many of them are listening to their public sector union bosses rather than looking at the math and just taking a common sense approach to it to say, do I really want to pay Russian roulette with my retirement? It's not roulette, it's Russian roulette, because all it takes is one federal bankruptcy court judge to say, for example, yeah, states cannot go bankrupt under federal bankruptcy code, but if pension funds go upside down and they can no longer pay out beneficiaries, then I'm going to say that pension funds are separate and distinct from the state, and instead of checks in the mail, you get IOUs until they figure it out.
Or you have a 15%, 20% haircut. And I think that's a real distinct possibility. That's why I think at some point, and I think the state ruling recently that came out last week.
This is on Chicago pensions.
On Chicago pensions, where it starts to say that things like pension benefits can be collectively bargained if there's some exchange, some consideration given for changes in the pension benefits.
Kind of simple contract law theory.
Exactly. And in that being the case, I think it behooves the unions. And let's talk about a Chicago policeman or fireman. We've talked a lot about teachers and others. The worst funded pensions in Illinois right now are the Chicago fire and police pensions. They have about 25 cents of every dollar they should have in their account. So imagine you have your 401k and you think you open it up, you think you have $100,000. You open it and there's only $25,000. You're missing 3/4 of the money. That's exactly what's happening to policemen and firemen right now. And I don't know why they're not jumping up and down and saying, I want a new deal. I want something better. Promise me what I've earned, but give me a new deal going forward. And I think that's what they should be fighting for, because they run the big risk of having a massive haircut.
If you have a police fund or a firefighter pension fund that's only a quarter funded, are those pension funds salvageable?
I think we've run numbers. We think we can salvage them, but it's painful, right? And you've got to have a long-term process, but you got to end the game now. But effectively, in any private sector scenario, they're bankrupt. They're done. They would have been closed up if they were part of a private sector group. They would have been closed, liquidated, and gone. So it's something that I think they have a huge interest in hitting the table and negotiating. Yeah, I think the way to look at this, Dan, is that, if we can stop the bleed now and move to a new 401k style plan going forward for all benefits earned going forward, then what we do is we treat the unfunded liability as debt. Chicago just has a bunch of debt, and it's going to take years to pay that debt off. But I think it can work with Chicago's numbers if we stop the pain now.
Then you can start to bend the cost curve and
exactly
catch up.
But it's not just, of course, police and fire. You've got to do that for teachers' pensions and for the other pensions in Chicago. So it has to be a whole deal, because remember, you have one taxpayer in Chicago, and that one taxpayer has to pay all those pensions and Cook County pensions as well. And, of course, the shortfall at the state level. So we have to be careful to respect the taxpayers in Chicago.
And it seems to me the taxpayers are starting to understand what is in the offing. And I just look at outmigration. I mean, is there any better indication of the vitality of a community, county, a state, than whether people choose to live there or not? And in 2015, according to the census, Cook County lost more population than any other county in the country. This against the backdrop of the state of Illinois continuing to compete with New Jersey for the largest outmigration year after year.
I think that's the biggest issue, and it's something that we talk a lot about, is respecting the taxpayer. And I don't think Rahm Emanuel, Michael Madigan, they don't understand. Or they may understand, but they don't care. It doesn't fit into the political calculus. But the reality is that people are leaving, and I think more telling than the 2015 numbers is the outmigration that occurred between 2000 and 2010 by middle-class blacks. 180,000 blacks were lost during that period. And if you look at what happened in Detroit, first you lost your white taxpayers when you had the white flight. But the problem really happened in Detroit when the middle-class blacks left. And then the tax base was gone. And I think Chicago has to start thinking about how to protect its residents. Doesn't matter what color they are. But if you don't protect your tax base, you're done. And we're entering that spiral today.
Well, that's what's interesting. So I have a conversation with my alderman. I'm in the 42nd ward, one of the wards that looks fancy on the outside. And, you hear this propaganda from the likes of a Brendan Riley, who's just a toady for Madigan and for Tiny Dancer. Well, look at the planters on Michigan Avenue. And look at the tower cranes with new rental units going up in Streeterville. Everything's, on the up and up. And my response to them is, even let's just accept your premise that this ward, one of 50 wards, is on the up and up. Explain to me how you think that, let's say there's 10 wards, 20% of the city, that are kind of revenue producing wards that have substantial economic activity ongoing. So you're telling me that 80% of the city can burn to the ground around us and we're not going to be impacted? Do you really believe that? Does anybody really believe that except a craven feudal lord, which is what these aldermen are?
Well, I remember the first time I went to Detroit right after the bankruptcy, and I came back and wrote about it and the lessons I learned from it as it relates to Chicago. And, a lot of pushback. Chicago is not a Detroit.
No.
And
never happened here.
And listen, Chicago's not a Detroit when you think about diversification of businesses. You walk down in the Loop here, it's hot, man. It's rocking, right? It's a lot of stuff going on. But I think what people forget is bankruptcy is not about what you look like. Bankruptcy is whether you can afford to pay your debts. It's simply that. And you take the best paid athletes in the nation. A lot of them go bankrupt. They're making $100 million, but they go bankrupt because they don't manage their spending. And I think that's where Chicago is.
Yeah, they have, wait. How can they be bankrupt? They've got a nice home. Right. And they got a nice car and they wear nice clothes.
Yeah.
How can they be bankrupt? How can Antoine Walker, he's an NBA champion. How can he go bankrupt? Terrible investments.
Exactly.
He put his money to use in all the wrong places. That's how you can go bankrupt.
Yeah. And I think that's where Chicago is. Chicago is exactly there. Now let me make one other point, and I think this is important. Chicago's got a big footprint, right? We used to have 3.5 million people, right? Yeah. We're down way below that. We're down, in our population in Chicago now is below the 1920s. That's a massive change. Yet we still have that same infrastructure. And I don't just mean physical infrastructure like the highways and all that. We have that same public sector infrastructure. And that public sector infrastructure is not shrinking fast enough with the city. What it's doing is it keeps growing. The cost of that infrastructure, the unions, the teachers, the police and fire, is too expensive. And it's outpacing the growth of what people make in the city. And that's what's going to break us. So
you wanted to talk about the taxation that your median Chicago resident faces. Talk about it. What you see in Chicago is a lot of people saying, oh, property taxes are much, much lower in Chicago than they are in the suburbs. Subsidized by commercial.
Subsidized by commercial, one. But two, they are relatively lower. But what people don't talk about is Daley was a genius, and we all know that. He knew that he shouldn't go after property taxes. So what he did and the others who followed is they came up with a bottled water tax and a tire. I mean, there's a $1 tire tax. Then, they had red light cameras. They had every kind of tax and fee to hide the fact that they're raising taxes on you. And it's really hard to track what's going on. So, we did all the numbers, and it's amazing how much higher when you take all the taxes that they are in Chicago than in any other city. Evanston's a competitor, but any other city in Illinois. The taxes are tremendously high. And so I think there's a lot of deceit. The press hasn't wanted to talk about it properly. None of the politicians want to talk about it. But Chicagoans are taxed out the wazoo. And it's, in the end, middle-class families know it. I think when we talked about the black families earlier, schools aren't working for them. Crime is certainly hurting them. And taxes are going against them. Why stay? And I think that's a question that people ask themselves.
Well, sure. And they ask themselves and they're answering in the negative. Why stay?
Yeah.
It makes no sense to say, I'm not going to stay.
And it's not easy for people to leave, right? It's hard to pick up and leave.
Sure. You lay down roots. You made an investment here. It is a great city. It's a beautiful city. It's a fun city. Great restaurants and nightlife and and arts and culture. Why would I want to leave here? I don't want to leave here. But you're making it such that I can't make it make sense to be here. And frankly, even someone like me, who does relatively well, because I got this, phony baloney job on the radio that pays me a lot of money to work 20 hours a week. Even me, I say, well, gosh, move over to Northwest Indiana and lower my cost of living by 40%, my monthly nut by 40%. What am I doing here?
Well, yeah, you're hitting on the issue that recently I was in South Chicago, and I met with this company, Modern Drop Forge. They're a big steel plant stamper. And, they tried to stay in Illinois. They worked hard. Nobody paid attention to them. This is a year and a half ago. And so they finally looked at Indiana. And Indiana opened their arms, said, come here. The company eventually moved there. I was at I think I was telling you about this. I went to their new facility. It was like this massive, beautiful, huge facility, state of the art. And a lot of the workers who didn't want to move to Indiana from Chicago, they went and they looked at the house prices. They said, wow. They looked at the property taxes, much lower. School choice.
And what you get for those numbers in terms of home and property.
It was a huge home. And he said he took his wife, this worker who didn't want to go, he took his wife. They moved. And they're so happy. And I saw him at the new plant. He's ecstatic. And, that's what people are experiencing. And we shouldn't force people to look at those alternatives. But I think what we're doing is we're making it such that people don't move because their taxes are high. People move because things get difficult. The opportunities aren't there. It gets too costly. They finally make a calculus in some way that says, hey, I'm going to go somewhere where there's a new opportunity.
Well, right.
Whether it's Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, whatever it is.
It's cumulative. Yeah. It's not a single tax. It's not that, if I don't have a city sticker, my fine is going to be like $42,000 to make the numbers work for the city for 1 year in additional. It's just the cumulative impact of every time you turn around, you're just being fleeced. Mm-hmm. Fleeced.
Yeah. And so, so it comes around to, that's why we need these massive reforms. And until we get them.
Which, by the way, the funny thing is, the other side that has been unwilling to advance these structural reforms says we need these structural reforms. What did Rahm come in on? He came in on a wave of, here's a tough guy who was the chief of staff to the president of the United States, and he's going to make these tough decisions. He's going to endure the political capital that must be spent to make the difficult, tough decisions to bring the city back, to right the financial ship. And he hasn't done it.
This is Rombo, right? Rombo. He was the guy who was going to not let a crisis go to waste. And, a lot of people were excited.
Should have been the leading indicator that this was not a tough guy.
A lot of people were excited. And, when he is amazing because he actually did something which is pretty bold when he first came in. He went down to Springfield. And he sounded like he was proposing the Illinois Policy Institute's ideas. He talked about COLA, cost of living reforms, reducing them. He talked about bringing retirement ages down. And he talked about optional 401k style plans for workers. That was awesome. He actually went down to Springfield and did that, and Daley didn't do that. He didn't go down to Springfield. So there was a lot of hope at the beginning, but quickly, once the negotiations got tough, once Karen Lewis put her foot down, he caved.
Well, the 401k thing is interesting because the response you get from a lot of people is, well, I don't want to be subject to market fluctuations. I guess it's okay if everybody else who's not in the public sector is subject to market fluctuations with respect to their 401ks. But we don't. We want to guarantee the defined benefit plan. And so the response to that we want this guarantee, 401k doesn't work for us at the university level. This was kind of an underreported story, but you were the first one to kind of alert me to this. There are thousands of actual university employees, public employees in this state, who are part of a 401k retirement system within the larger public university system. So, number one, is it working for them? Number two, if it is, why don't we scale it?
Well, what's amazing is that somewhere along the way, 1998, not Mike Madigan, but a guy named Robert Madigan, he passed a law that allowed university professors to have a 401k style plan. Why? University professors wanted that portability. They wanted to control their retirement fund. They wanted it to be in their name that they could take when they left the state if they left. Now, what's amazing is that we would allow a professor to have that right, but not a Chicago fireman or policeman or a teacher who should have their ownership, their own title and control over that money. Rather than being dependent on Madigan or Rahm Emanuel, these university professors can take their money and nobody can touch it. And what's interesting about that whole thing is we're sitting almost at record highs again in the stock market. These guys are doing really well. The money that's in there is going up. And despite these massive recovery, the massive recovery of the stock market, Illinois pensions continue to do worse and worse. So it's a funny dynamic.
The public sector pension funds.
The public sector pensions get worse despite this massive improvement in the stock market.
So I mean, I guess the argument would be made, well, wait a second, if Dan Proft with his financial guy can figure out where to put his money and how to distribute risk and how to have a balanced portfolio, then why can't a Chicago police officer, a Chicago firefighter, Chicago teacher do the same thing? They can do the same thing. I'm no smarter than they are.
No,
and my financial advisors are no smarter than the financial advisors they could have access to.
And there's a lot. They make it so easy now to invest. You just call Charles Schwab, right? You call Fidelity, and they make it easy. Yeah, I think that's the whole thing. Is that public sector employees have gotten so in bed with the government that they're letting the government control their lives for them, including their retirement lives. And the government's made a disaster of that. And people are scared that they may not have a retirement. And so, we argue that the workers should have control. They should have that freedom to control their own retirement account. If they want the state to manage it, let them. But for those who want something different, give them the option. It's only fair.
I want to go back to the Chicago Public School System for a second because we got a couple of shibboleths that are always advanced by the teachers union and their acolytes that need to be addressed. One is this idea the state's not paying its fair share to CPS. That's the problem. Well, why don't we just start there? Let's do one at a time. Let's start there. So CPS receives a majority of its funding from the state, which is materially different than all the Collier County districts, well, most of the Collier County districts. And for the Collier County districts that it's not materially different, that are majority funded by the state, they end up, districts like Matson, low income, with high low income, they end up subsidized. So you have low income people in Matson subsidizing people in Chicago.
Well, let me just hit the first point, and we've run the numbers. We're going to be releasing it pretty soon. What Forrest Claypool says is that, look, we have, and he's using a logic that I don't think makes sense, but let's follow him with his logic. He says they have 20% of the students. They should get 20% of what the state doles out to all the districts. And he says that that's not true. Well, we've run the numbers, and if you take the last 10 years, including pensions, because he argues that Chicago, the Chicago Public School District pays their own pensions, whereas the state pays the pensions of all the other school districts. He says that's unfair.
Right.
And you could, at face value, agree with that. What Forrest Claypool doesn't tell you is that the funding formulas for education more than make up for what the city loses out in pensions. So bottom line is that we ran the numbers for the last 10 years. Chicago outperforms. They've gotten more than their share every single year in the last 10 years, with the exception of this past year. They've gotten more on average than all the other school districts. So they're getting their share. And I think we're going to debunk his myth. He has to stop complaining that he needs a state bailout and start focusing on what reforms he can pass in Chicago. I think that's where he really needs to focus on.
And so let's just kind of, again, do this like a little bit of classroom math, not Common Core style either, because I don't know how to do math Common Core style. But the city of Chicago spends about $15,000, a little north of there, but just let's use round numbers, $15,000 per kid per year. So classroom of 30, keep it simple. That's $450,000 per classroom in the city of Chicago. 650 odd schools, a little bit less than 400,000 kids like it normally used to be because of the exodus from Chicago. So $450,000 per classroom. So the teacher all in costs the district $100, $120 a year. Yeah. Let's say you spend another $50,000 in supplies. Okay, so that's $150. It's $1,700 per kid for the pension pickup, for the pension costs. Mm-hmm. So again, let's round up to $2,000. So that's another $60,000. So that gets me to $210. Let's say we throw another $50 in for the building, the infrastructure, all that per kid. So that's $260. Where's the other $200,000 per classroom in Chicago go? Does anybody know? Because I asked Karen Lewis this question. I asked Forrest Claypool this question. I asked aldermen in the city of Chicago this question. Nobody has the answer to that question. And the other thing that's even more infuriating than not having the answer is nobody much seems to care.
Well, it kind of reminds me of, after they closed the 50 schools, right? And I forget who did the analysis, but they couldn't find the computers. They couldn't find a lot of the supplies. They were gone. And they can't track themselves. I think the biggest issue with CPS is that they're just too damn big, right? It's too big. It's a monolith, and they can't manage themselves. And I think that's the big issue.
So at the state level or the city level, because the dynamics are very similar, Illinois Policy Institute, what's a path forward? What is, everybody gets the benefits they've earned up to a date certain. What's the path forward? What does that look like in terms of retirement age, pension contribution, all of the cost of living adjustments, all of the drivers for cost in the system? What should that look like that is respectful and reasonable, that we could potentially afford, that provides that balance?
So let's come back to that state university retirement system plan that's a 401k. That thing's been around for 17 years. You've got about 18,000, 17,000, 18,000 workers and retirees in it. What that plan does, and the people who are on that 401k style plan, they don't get Social Security. So the 401k style plan they get is robust enough to meet IRS standards and to give a sufficient retirement. And what it does is the state puts in 7% into the 401k every paycheck, and the employee puts in 8%. So every paycheck period, 15% is going into that retirement account. And that's been deemed good enough, and it's been around for a long time, and many people get it. So we think that's a good basis for creating a plan for all workers, new workers, and for benefits going forward, choosing some starting date. We think that would be a great start. There could be debates about how to structure it, but we think that's a really good start, because going forward, what it would mean is that all the benefits that have been earned, any worker or retiree would continue to get. Retirees wouldn't be affected by this plan, but all workers would have earned their benefits up to a point, and going forward, everything goes into our 401k style plan. So it's a fair plan. You respect retirement ages, you respect all that, and it does a lot to fix the problem in Illinois. We've run numbers, and it depends on how strict we are with the terms, but we believe that we can cut the unfunded liability by 30 to 40%, which is pretty massive.
Substantial.
And we can create a repayment plan on the rest of the debt that gets us out of this problem, in 30 years, but in one where there's control and certainty, rather than the one we have today, which is uncertain.
And to repeat, just for emphasis, that means you're not messing with the retirement age, you're not messing with COLAs or the other component parts of a person's employment or retirement?
Correct. I think what you want to do is, leave what people have earned, because I think it's all a question of constitutionality.
But I mean, even prospectively, even for the new hires today,
new hires today would get 401k plans.
Well, we're right, but you're saying, hey, if you have 30 years in and you're 50, 55, 60, whatever, because you've got the 401k, we've essentially more or less achieved a Solomonic balance of we're paying 7%, you're paying 8%, you're managing your funds. It's not defined benefit, it's defined contribution,
right,
like exists in the private sector, to the extent that even those exist in the private sector today, and everybody's charting their own course.
Right, and then from then on, we just manage the debt that we have and the outstanding liabilities, but we don't keep creating these unfunded liabilities, which we've seen just keep growing every single year. They grow out of control. It's like a mortgage that grows every year. Rather than paying it down, it just keeps growing and growing, no matter how much you put in it. Right. That would be the example of a homeowner. You keep paying down your debt, and it keeps getting bigger, and you can't ever get control of it.
Right, and it would also obviate the need to make our mortgage payment with a credit card, which is essentially what we're doing now. Exactly. To the extent that we still get credit card companies that will issue us credit cards effectively, because at some point the bond markets are going to seize up and they're going to disallow borrowing except at usurious, soprano rates like CPS just did.
Here's another point I wanted to make. So we talked about this 401k style plan already existing in Illinois. So it's not like some pipe dream we have. This is something that is a legitimate plan that works. And if it's good enough for our university professors, why isn't it good enough for anybody else? But it's not just Illinois that's done this. We've had massive reforms across the country. And Michigan actually started this in 1997. They moved all state employees to 401k style plans back in 1997.
Michigan. Big union state.
Big union state in 1997. And so they got ahead of this a long time ago. Let me give you another state that made a big change. They did a hybrid, half pension, half 401k style plan, and that was Rhode Island. Democratically controlled legislature. They got it passed. Big reform, very painful, but they did it. And Alaska has passed in 2006 a 401k style plan for new employees, and most recently Oklahoma passed one. So this is something that's happening across the country. It's not some dream. It's happening.
Well, so the question, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, so wait a second, if it's happening across the country and it's working for 17,000 university professors who are not bitching about it, at least we don't hear from them bitching about it, why haven't we scaled it already?
Well, I think it's just been easy for Karen Lewis and others to say the rich aren't paying enough. All we need are more taxes. And unfortunately, the union members have bought that argument. They bought the argument that the taxes need to go up. There's a solution. There's a promise been made. Don't change what we've got as a promise no matter whether it's 20 years into the future. Let's just raise taxes to solve our problems. And at some point, there's going to be a revolt. And if it's not a big revolt, it's a quiet revolt by people just leaving the state, leaving the city over and over again.
And isn't that the problem? I mean, this is, again, it's a political problem, but people leave the state, or even, I mean, you essentially have a hollowing out, right, in the city and the state. People that are insulated from bad public policy, the very rich and the very poor that are beneficiaries of transfer payments, they don't feel it. They don't live in the world of trying to make ends meet. And so that's what you're left with. And frankly, that's the constituency of the left. That's the constituency of the established power structure in Chicago and the General Assembly.
Yeah, and I think the big issue that's going to drive and continue to drive change are the property taxes. We're seeing places like you said, Matson and nearby Southland communities where the tax rates on property, so the effective tax rate on a home is about 4 or 5% of the value. So if somebody were to try to buy that house today, they would have to pay the cash for that home, or they'd have to pay the value of that home. And within 20 years, because of taxes, they will have repaid for that home again.
So for most people, with their 30-year mortgage, they pay for their home twice. What you're saying is in Illinois and a lot of regions, you're going to pay for your house a third time because of the property taxes.
Exactly, and that's why people are actually starting to walk away from their homes in places, in the Southland area. So you got a place where the manufacturing companies have gone. You see the big swaths of land just empty, and you're starting to see now these nice big homes that have collapsed in value, and people are walking away because they can't afford it anymore. Between the mortgage and a second mortgage being the property taxes, they're leaving.
And here's something else I hear too: is a lot of small to mid-sized businesses, 25 to 250 employees. They don't make headlines when they leave. They don't make headlines when they lay people off. They're not big enough, but they're impactful. They represent 3/4 of the jobs in the state. Mm-hmm. They're just quietly closing up shop or downsizing and kind of methodically moving operations somewhere else. And it's one of those things like the old kind of sun also rises. How did you go bankrupt? Gradually, then suddenly. So it's kind of the whole thing is like, wait a second, where did all the businesses in Elk Grove Village and the ring suburbs around O'Hare go? Mm-hmm. Oh, they slowly moved out over the course of the last 10 years. Now, how do you get them back?
Yeah, and it's really hard. And that's why I always argue that, I talk a lot about the one reform that we could do tomorrow, and it could be agreed upon between all the parties, is new employees. Moving their 401k style plans tomorrow. New employees don't have a contract. They're not protected by the Constitution. They would just enter with a new contract. Make it a reasonable, fair 401k style plan. And people say, well, that wouldn't save a whole lot of money. And I'm saying it may not save a whole lot of money, but that sure would send a different message than any message that we've sent over the last 25 years. And that would send a message to the rating agencies that reform is coming. That send a message to future employers, people that want to live in Illinois. But we got to send a positive message. And right now, there is no positive message. And we know with the budget fight, there's no positive message. We need a positive message.
I want to level up one level of education to post-secondary education in universities. We've talked about this cadre of university professors in a 401k system, okay. But a lot of the discussion and the consternation in the context of this current budget impasse, state budget impasse, is about universities, and they're not receiving the funding they'd become accustomed to from the state. And so there's the prospect of laying off employees, and there's a protest on campuses, state colleges, universities, and it's all directed at the state of Illinois. What are they doing? They're divesting from higher education. Well, it turns out, and this is some good work that's been done by State Representative Mark Batnick, who's a freshman Republican from Oswego, Plainfield area. It turns out that if you do a little bit of comparison in terms of what the state of Illinois provides in per pupil support as compared to their conference peers, whether it's Illinois State in the Missouri Valley or University of Illinois in the Big Ten, it turns out we're providing almost twice as much state support per pupil than the conference peers in other states. And yet tuition at our state schools is still 40% higher than their peers, their conference peers in those states. Explain that dynamic.
Well, we looked at the numbers in higher education, and it's easy to blame the lack of a budget right now. It's easy to do that because it's easy to point the finger at something.
That's why they're doing it.
And that's why they're doing it. And of course, no budget has created a crack. It's showing all the cracks that exist in higher ed. But this problem has been building for 10 and 15 years and more, right? And a lot of it has to do with how much public funding is making into education from the federal government and the state. And what these universities are doing is they're taking all the available money they can find, and they're hiring administrative staffs that are much too large, they're bloated, and they're paying massive salaries and massive pensions. And so when you look at what's happening is tuitions are having to double, not because education is getting that much better. It's all going to fund big administrations and super big pensions.
Well, and we saw, we talked about the Chicago teacher strike in the not too distant past. How about the U of IC 1100 professorate strike? That was just 2 years ago, 2014. And they want to lift the floor for essentially part-time adjunct facility from 30 grand to 45 grand, 50% increase in base salary. And of course, that levels all the way up. We increase the floor here, and that increases the floor at every rung above that. And so, how do we get out of that trap?
Well, it's the same issue we're talking pensions again.
We're talking salaries plus pensions.
Well, what happens is that these salaries are high, and so what's happened now is that when you take the state appropriations that go to education, to higher ed, they've actually grown a lot in the last decade. They've grown about 60% in the last decade, from 2.6 billion to over 4 billion. So it's a big chunk of change. The problem is that 50% of all that money, 50% of what the state appropriates, isn't making it to higher ed. It's going to pay for pensions. And I was amazed when we did our work the other day to find community colleges paying their top person $500,000 a year. And
you mean like the president of the university?
The president, right. And of course, like you said, all those salaries get scaled up.
Well, tell us the story. I mean, this is just for illustrative purposes, because it speaks to a larger cultural problem. In your research, the white paper that I read that you did in concert with colleagues at the Illinois Policy Institute, a $900,000 administrator at the University of Illinois?
Yeah, $900,000.
What the frack does that administrator do that warrants $900,000?
Well, included in that was a roughly $450,000 retention bonus.
Okay.
After a few years.
So what the frack does that administrator making $400 grand do that warrants a $450,000 retention bonus?
Exactly. Now think about what that means. So that person will probably get somewhere in the range of, who knows, $8 to $9 to $10 million in pensions. Think about that money, how many scholarships that would fund in a given year for kids to attend Chicago State. That one person.
But the argument you'll hear, I mean, you may hear it incredulously, but you're going to hear it. Well, you want to attract and retain talent in academia, don't you?
So you can say that. Now the question is, to how many people do you pay that? There's a great study done by the Illinois General Auditor, and he looked at the number of administrators that these universities have, and it's amazing. We looked at Chicago State.
This is like the Teldar paper story, like all these vice presidents, they just send memos back and forth. I can't figure out what they do. This is the Michael Douglas moment. Nobody knows what they do,
but they're walking around the halls. But the point was, for Chicago State, they have one administrator for every 18 students. One administrator for every 18 students.
Not one professor.
No, they have one faculty member for every 16 students. So it's almost the same number. So you have
one administrator per every professor?
Yeah, so you could be sitting in a class and your professor would be giving you a lesson, and there'd be an administrator right there watching over, making sure things were good.
A supervisor.
And again, a lot of that is because of federal mandates, et cetera, but you can't have that kind of bloat and not expect your tuitions to double as they have in Chicago State, to the point where, and here's the sad part, the tuitions have gotten so high that you can't have a kid who wants to work and go to school because it's just too expensive. And that's why they've come to rely on scholarships. They've come to rely on free money because it's no longer affordable. And if these community colleges were meant for these kids to have an opportunity, why have we priced them out of touch?
So at the post-secondary education level, whether it's community colleges, and we have some good community colleges, 50 some odd community colleges that provide, at least you could get your gen ed requirements knocked out at a lower cost per credit hour at the community college level before you go on to a four-year university. But what you're suggesting is that, well, actually, that's not even the case anymore. And by the way, because K through 12 education is so subpar, a lot of the costs at the freshman, sophomore, post-secondary education level is remediation. You're paying for high school twice. I mean, if you talk to community college presidents and university presidents, college presidents in the state, they'll tell you, I'm paying the 1 in 3 kids that are going on to post-secondary education, I'm paying for them to do high school again for the first year because they're not prepared to do post-secondary work. So we're paying for high school twice, and then we're paying for administrators layered on to kids that are going to post-secondary education, not ready for the work. And then we wonder why the medieval poetry major can't get a job when they get out of NIU or Illinois State or U of I or wherever, or Northwestern for that matter.
Yeah, and I think you're capturing the problem really well. And what's really scary is that not only can't they get a job, but many of them have debt that they'll never be able to repay. And that's why you're seeing these problems, right? You're seeing trillions of dollars and maybe becoming the next big problem in our country is that all this student debt that kids can't pay back. A lot of it, again, bring it all back around, a lot of it driven by pensions.
And so, I mean, so fundamentally, if we're thinking about K through 12 education, and we're thinking about higher education with the bleak financial picture that we've painted, and these systems that have effectively been set up, let's be just real honest about it, have effectively been set up to pay generous salaries and benefits to the adults in the system, not to educate children and prepare them to success in life. That's not what's happening. Clearly, that's not what's happening for the majority. Then if there was 1 or 2 things where you could wave a magic wand at the Illinois Policy Institute and say, this is the way to kind of halt and do a 180, take a step back, and then chart a completely different course. What are those 1 or 2 things that get us off this path to ruin that we're on and onto a path of fulfilling the mission as stated of K through 12 and post-secondary education?
No, I think K through 12, I'm huge in empowering parents. I don't think that our administrators, and again, I'm speaking generally, of course, there's some great public schools, and there's people who are dedicated. Don't get me wrong.
There are at the post-secondary level.
Listen, and it's not that people aren't dedicated and they don't care. I think systemically, and I take CPS, I'm sure there's thousands of teachers and employees who care. I think the system is broken. System, I'd say, is morally bankrupt. And it's not going to work. And so until you get into a situation, and again, we're seeing this happen again, same like we talked about 401ks, we're seeing the same thing for school choice plans. Parents should be given the choice over where their kids go to school. And that's one, super empowering for parents who feel like they've been just totally left out of this. And that they think that more money is a solution rather than being given a choice and control over their children's education. So I think that's number one. And we've seen, we just saw Nevada, all of its 500,000 public school students have been given the choice of a voucher up to $5,000. All of them. It's amazing, statewide, amazing. And this is there's now 26 states that offer school choice. Why isn't Illinois one of them? Why isn't Chicago one of them?
So that's K through 12.
That's K through 12.
At the university level, the problem is choice, right? Because Illinois are the automakers in the 70s, have been insulated from competition, and kids are taking their GI Bill, their Pell Grant, their Stafford loan money, and they're not going to school in Illinois.
Right, they're going outside.
Right, and they're not coming back.
And they're not coming back. And I think, I think the higher ed is a bigger problem because there's also a federal piece to it, right? You got all that federal money. Schools know it. Schools know that the kids can borrow, and so therefore they raise their tuition and their hiring, their jobs program to match that. So I think we need to stop a lot of what's been happening there and that would allow the cost to come down dramatically if we didn't have all these subsidies feeding the cost up. But until we do that, I think it's going to be tough. But that said, there's a lot that can be done locally because we don't have to pay the salaries that we pay, and two, we don't have to have the administrative bloat that we have, and we certainly don't need to have the pensions that we have. There's no reason why people are getting $7 and $8 and $10 and $12 million pensions.
So other than scaling the 17,000, go back to the 17,000 person universe of university professors in a 401k style program, would you say that the state should starve the beast of academia and force them to make changes that are otherwise not inclined to make as long as you keep the spigot open? Well,
sadly, that's what's happening, right? And it shouldn't be that way. And, you got a lot of people in pain right now. You have kids who thought they had a scholarship, now they don't. They don't care about those problems. They had a plan. You've got teachers who thought they had a job, professors who thought they had a job. They may lose them, and the way it's happening now shouldn't be happening. It should be, the administrations taking control of what they do and running an efficient system, but they've never been forced to do it. And Governor Rauner and the budget impasse is making them do that. They don't like it. They don't like having a gun to their head, but it's forcing them to look at their costs, and it's how it may happen.
So effectively, I mean, it's K through 12 or university, the common denominator is you have to have families be the accountability mechanism for how their tax dollars are being spent, for the experience of their children. They have to be an accountability mechanism for their local K through 12 schools. They have to be an accountability mechanism for the universities they send their kids, for those kids going on to post-secondary education.
That's absolutely right. And I think, it's interesting when you think about Chicago, and this comes back to, again, empowering parents, empowering families, empowering the residents, not the bureaucrats. When you look at the Laquan McDonald case, right, and you've got a Chicago, a police force and or a mayor or a attorney general who can hide information from the public for more than a year. When you have a situation where a school district can strike 2 times in a row on families, when you have a police force, when you try to take the problems of Jason Van Dyke and discipline him.
The police officer
who shot Laquan McDonald. But you can't use his old history of complaints. There's a lot of things that the public is not seeing, and they've ceded too much of their power as residents to the government. And a lot of what we're talking about today is giving the power back to the residents, give it back to the families, give it back to the people.
He is Ted Dabrowski. He's the Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. Nobody does more numbers, reality-based research on these intractable problems in terms of the quality of public education in the state from pre-K through post-secondary than Ted and his team at the Illinois Policy Institute. You should read their stuff religiously so you're empowered with the information they have researched and culled to be that accountability mechanism that we're talking about. Pleased to have Ted Dabrowski, Vice President of Policy from the Illinois Policy Institute, on this edition of Against the Current. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.